is Bernard Sweeney, and this is the first podcast I've done in the best part of a year. I've been away meditating and stuff like that, and not fighting with the world. Well, I had a few scraps. But I'm joined with two extraordinary gentlemen. Robbie McVeigh is our special guest today. And Robbie's a sociologist, and he's written a lot of paperwork. He's a top-notch researcher, renowned, revered, and all that wonderful stuff. And Robbie's going to tell you a lot more about himself in a moment. And we also got Dilean MacSearraigh, or Dylan Foley, depends on which one is, on which state he's in. But Dylan is an archaeologist / historian. So we've got two very well-educated people. And myself, uneducated, so I'm a bit outside the colony. I have a different perspective, a different school of thought. We call it the Canting Academy. And if you're wondering where that is established, well, that's in the world of fantastical imaginations. So we're going to stay there. That's where I'll be coming from. And the two guys who were more scientific in their fields of expertise, I most certainly will enjoy this conversation. I think it's also, of course, not just worth mentioning, but I feel the need to mention the tragedy that took place in Donegal, where 10 lives were lost, and our condolences and our thoughts go out to all the families and the families of the victims. And also a reminder on this particular day, it's also the 7th-year anniversary of the Carrick Mines fire. We would only hope, as a personal traveller, would say that to hope the state doesn't blame the victims, because that's an awful thing to do to people. So we're going to get on with this. We're going to have a general conversation, and I hope it'll be the beginning of many conversations. We'll have various guests on. But we'll see how it goes. I'm confident we'll have more talks on this because there's a lot to talk about. And I'm going to hand it over to Robbie. But again, for people just tuning in and they don't know, I have no idea what the hell we're talking about. In the context of this, it's about Ireland, it's about colonization, it's about what we call the traveller mentality or the traveller culture and the settled culture. And it's been recognized, and particularly in 2017, that there is a distinction between these people in how they think and their cultural traits. So that's the kind of focus, these two traits, these two cultures, and colonization. So I'm going to hand it over to Robbie. I was going to call you Robert Serpolsky at one stage. He's a biologist. But anyhow, I'll hand it over to Robbie McVeigh. And yeah, Robbie, you can talk and introduce yourself as long as you like, my friend.
All right. Well, I suppose the most useful way of doing this is kind of what we talked about before, is that if you trace how I got involved in doing research work with travellers and solidarity with travellers in terms of struggle for traveller equality and justice in Ireland. It's really, if you go back far enough, it's because I had an interest in racism. And so that puts me in, I suppose, in a slightly different position to other people who maybe would come through as anthropologists and people like that who are kind of interested in traveller culture and ethnicity. And I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong, but it's just it's a different way of thinking about the kind of challenges we have. So my general interest was in racism, and more particularly the political work that racism does. Like how is racism used to do political work? So that's the very starting point. And then I had a more specific interest in sectarianism in the North, which hadn't been particularly well theorized or thought about. So I started doing work around that. And then because there was so little work being done in the North around racism at all, of course, when the issue of travellers and ethnicity, and in particular the push to get the race relations order extended to cover the 6 counties in the 1980s, whenever that was happening, there really wasn't anybody doing work around race in general. So I got pulled into to trying to answer the specific question of, are travellers an ethnic group, and do travellers experience racism? So I mean, I know there's a Travision take in ethnicity, but the main reason that ethnicity was important in that context is because you almost to qualify, if you like, for protection from racism, there had to be proof that you constitute an ethnic group. So it was a necessary hurdle that we had to get across, and that's how I got dragged into the sector. And of course, once you're in the sector, you get involved in travel organizations, things like that, which I did, more particularly in the North, but doing research in the area. But if you go back to the very start of it, it was really about that question of what kind of political work is racism doing. And in Ireland, of course, you can't ask that question without thinking about the way that anti-traveller racism is used by politicians to make interventions politically. So you can kind of see the connection between the big picture of understanding racism in the world and the smaller local picture of understanding anti-traveller racism in Ireland. So that's if you like my trajectory into this world, and that's still kind of the issue that I'm most interested in terms of, you know, trying to do work around is why are people racist towards travellers, and what are the political consequences of that racism?
Yeah, it's quite a brilliant introduction. I'll hand you over to Dilean, and Dilean can give a bit of a spiel himself, if he'd like.
Well, our archaeology, as they asked me, I work with Bernard on for a good few years now on these kind of things. But I suppose in relation to that, I mean, I'd be predictable enough in archaeology terms, in the sense that, my concern, I would have come from the kind of understanding, obviously, the older history of Ireland. You know, like, let's say long ago, Ireland's colonial background, how in archaeology we deal a lot with the destruction of the Gaelic world, how and why that happened, and what the less so in my, and I suppose here's the difference, is when I started working with Bernard on these things, it's because we would have intersected with the modern world, and this is something which might be a little unusual, but when I started working with Bernard on this, it's more to do, we began applying, say, like archaeology and history like that, especially new genetics information, and that to questions in the present, which of course is necessary. In a country like Ireland, we have a lot of, as Robbie would know, as we would all know, that the roots of the racism, no matter what kind of racism in the modern world, is mostly is rooted in colonial history. And Ireland, if nothing else, Ireland is one of the exemplars of colonial history, how it began and how it unfolded since about well, we could go right back to the 12th century, but even if we started in, say, the 16th century. And so there was a lot of disparities in even the way that I noticed, the way the Irish state, say, archaeology is a product, and we must remember this, product of the English system in Ireland, the states in Dublin and the like in the 19th century. And so it hasn't been great at addressing a lot of the facts that the political nature of how archaeology itself was set up, which was to legitimize the modern state, that kind of thing. And so I would have seen a lot of weird, strange anomalies just for being in the west of Ireland, for example. And we would study castles or something like that. I often give this example. We would study castles and we would use maps that had maps of the counties of Ireland and a distribution of castles mapped onto them. And even years ago, when I was first studying that in college, I would have kind of dawned on me gradually that this doesn't make any sense, because these counties didn't exist when these castles were built. Yeah. So why are we doing this now? and even though we're aware of the fact that this was the case, the state insists we still have this academic and state construction that kind of insists that somehow there's this eternal counties going off into the past, and even the ancient past has to be interpreted in terms of counties, which of course were English inventions. Mm-hmm. And so that's my interest. My interest is in reconstructing the Gaelic world ultimately. But of course, to do that, we have to deal with a lot of things that have been handed to us in the present. And a lot of that work, to be honest, it's a strange path, but between Bernard coming from activism and injustice on one side, and myself vaguely kind of walking into that from the other direction, it's an interesting journey, let's say. That's my kind of.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. The thing I would immediately pick up on from that is, you know, I completely agree in terms of the colonial history, obviously, but I think that in terms of traveller experience in Ireland, there's a striking new phase, if you like, after 1922. And I suppose that what I would suggest is that before 1922, the vast majority of Irish people, whether they were traveller or settled, had faced a hostile state, a state that didn't operate in their interests. And by that I mean the vast majority of the Catholic population, really whatever class background they came from. So 1922 marks the point at which those stories suddenly diverge, because for the first time the state does operate in the interest of at least a portion of the settled Catholic population. And then it re-intensifies the state re-intensifies its anti-travellerism after that period. So it's a very abrupt severing of the commonality that travellers and settled people experience under colonialism. And that, you know, if we want to understand what's wrong with the state and its relationship to travellers today, we have to date it. Actually, you know, you can see a lot of issues before 1922, but you have to date it from 1922 in the sense that that's the point at which a very profound division was in terms of the relationship with the state of travellers and the relationship with the state of settled people was instituted. And that's why that independence, if you like, or the whatever you want, however you want to characterize what happened in 1922, I would call it a white dominion. It definitely marks a new phase, and in some ways a worse phase in terms of traveller experience of the state.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
I can see why we would have no disagreement with that. Except that obviously we would go back a little bit further on that, because I would say that there's the division you're talking about of the state after 1922 becoming serving only a section of the population. Yeah. It, of course, is true, but we removed, to some extent in the southern state, we removed the top layer of the imperial empire. Yeah. Which had up to that point been mostly favoring Protestants and that kind of thing. Yeah. But what we would characterize, to put it simply, the reason we would go all the way back to the 1600s would be to actually understand that exact thing. Why does that conflict emerge? Why does the state seemingly suddenly turn its ire on travellers and have to other them that much after the 1920s? Well, we would say that would be the re-emergence of a very old conflict between what's the English colony, which was originally Catholic and had been for centuries within the Pale, and that the actual, what we constructed as the settled community, who now at that stage in 1922 are regarded as Irish as such, because they, you know, and they are in a way, but their actual descent of the systems, the laws, the courts, the academia, the church, all that kind of stuff, had actually really had its origins in Irish Catholic culture of the Pale specifically, and of the urban towns. Now in 1600, this was the minority culture in the country that was within the city walls, and it's vital for us to understand that the conquest in the 17th century extended that culture across the country as being the normal culture, and destroyed the Gaelic culture, or attempted to destroy all of the Gaelic culture, and basically to eliminate it as it had no history, wiped it out, you know, demolished all the buildings, it destroyed everything, as we know. So, however, what we have before even 1600 is about 400 years at least of this Pale state being within the Dublin state, the origin of the modern state even, being within its boundaries in the Pale, and having a culture of that it's the real Catholics, that it's the real Ireland, it's the legitimate one that's in control of the country. And so, just like taking the lid off of a kettle, or whatever way to put it, we would characterize that as being the 1922. What you said happened, absolutely happened, but we would say that it's actually not a sudden division, but the re-emergence of an old conflict between two forms of the original, let's say the most Gaelicized inhabitants of the country, all from, doesn't matter if it's travellers, Irish speakers, West of Ireland people, Ulster people, whatever. The further they are culturally from the Pale culture, more likely they are to be persecuted. And so we would suggest that that's the reason for the persecution, is that remove the empire, and now you have the re-emergence of an old conflict. Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, mine was more of a personal experience growing up. So I had certain forms of segregation, usual tinker, itinerant, gypsies, knackers, all them usual names. And yeah, that was long lasting. So to explain that to people that maybe wouldn't fully understand what it's like, but I'll give an example. And I've never thought about this until very, very recently. But if I was going into a court, into the local authorities, even if a village or a town or a shop, I come consciously aware that I'm a traveller. And there's almost an anxiety with it. And the mind starts racing faster and faster and faster. So that's a constant thing for travellers. And I think when we take a slight step back and we're looking at psychological issues, where now we're looking at traveller children dying, and our community dying at a life expectancy. It did never happen in the history unless we were getting struck down hundreds of years ago. It just didn't happen. Like all our previous generations in the 50s, the 60s, and 40s actually lived longer than the travellers do today. So it kind of told me there was a psychological issue going on here. But my early experiences also was a curiosity about settled people. Although the settled term wasn't in my head, I just knew they were different because we were different. So I had that in my head growing up the whole time. And then I got big into the mentalities. I was influenced by Star Trek and stuff like that, actually. And then I grew up looking at some of the civil rights movements, Malcolm X talking about the white liberals and all their fancy words and going nowhere and all this kind of stuff. And all of this was kind of connecting. I was like, that's very similar to what we're going through. So yeah, I was constantly conflicted with thought, asking a million questions in my mind, and nobody, absolutely nobody, could tell me at any time, it would be a teacher in a school or later on in the universities, why did all this happen? Why was there settled people, and why was there travellers, and why do we go at each other like this? So when I got a bit more into the history and understanding and colonization and the psychological effects it has, I came across what they call the surrender and regrant, which was in, I think, 1530. So that kind of stuck with me. Even a number of years ago when I couldn't read and write, I had taken a picture of it and I kept it in my phone. It was actually 11 years afterwards, when I went through a lot of psychological challenges, that I went back to it. So I was thinking about it, and it was because they, the 1600s, the English brought in their institutions. And even the guy called Edmund Spencer, his job was to change the psyche of the Irish, change the language, control them, dominate them. And even Queen Elizabeth, I think II, would have referred to Hugh O'Neill as a creature of their own because he was educated in Trinity College. So all these things have stuck with me, silly things at the time. You couldn't tell anyone because it sounds stone mad, like the one that flew over the cuckoo's nest. So all bottled up, I kept trying to patch it together. So then I was thinking that, okay, tinker, itinerant, traveller, all of these labels, they don't seem to mean the same thing to us as they do to settled people. It's like the word tinker, you dirty tinker, smelly tinker, and all this kind of words. So they had a kind of a very hostile meaning to them. So when you trace the words back to an English origins, this is what the English put on a group of Irish people that they also called noble savages, people who were depossessed or refugees because of a lot of conflict on the island. So for me, this was the beginning of the settled mentality. And then I started to realize, come 1922, no institutions had changed. Then I was thinking, oh, turn this right around. We're not ethnic. Let's say we're indigenous. We come to them words in a minute. But we say we're indigenous. And the settled people are the subculture of an English culture. Because why else would Irish people be calling us tinkers and itinerants and finding nomadism and ethnic and all these words strange when they're a very common practice in a Gaelic mentality? But in a settled mentality, there's something different, but they're almost also identical to what the English applied. So that kind of created this parallel of mentalities, traveller mentality, settled mentality. Another way of explaining this would be traveller culture and settled culture. Culture is based on your mentality, what you think, how you think, and so on and so forth. So that kind of creates that parallel. So going back briefly to both of your points, both of you are absolutely right. The ethnic thing, that's perfectly fine for the time that was in it. Ethnic, in a meaning, was an identity. There was something here to protect. We weren't quite sure what it was ourselves. And for the identity part, well, again, we can go back to the 1600s because you think about the Vagrancy Acts and all of these itinerants and vagabonds and tinkers and travellers, all of them came in a continuous line. So even if we didn't know our identity, these machines and institutions kept reminding us every single day that we were the other, we were different. So yeah, and also from a cultural aspect, we grew up in clans. I mean, on the outside it looked like gangs, but in the inside they're actually clans. And we had our spokespeople, our chieftain, my granduncle was our king, and stuff like this. Sounds very sillish and out of date now, but it lasted for centuries. And a lot of that we will see play out in the west of Ireland, with your McDonoughs, Wards, McKinleys, Sweeneys. All of them had clans, and all these traits: arranged weddings. Some clans wouldn't marry into other clans because it would weaken their position of clanship or whatever it might be. So there was a rich culture in that sense. Also, we were crumbling under the psychological pressures of the world around us, because we hadn't got a clue why these people were so upset all the time, what was bothering them so much. And I give an example. They'll tell you, say I've mentioned before, they'll tell you get an education, but just they'll close down a school. They'll tell you get a house, or they'll burn down the house. So there were always constantly full-on contradictions. They didn't know what they wanted. So I'll hand it back over to Robbie, because you walked along with Nan Joyce, Michael McDonough, and all these travelers. And I would say to anyone, particularly the disciplines like that, is that you would have had a very unique perspective to yourselves, because the way I would see that is this is an ancient old mentality. We're not the same people who were the generation before that, but these are the same systems that has been for generations before that. So one way or the other, we are outside of the colonial mentality. It's not about a traveler mentality or thinker mentality, it's just out of the colonial one.
I think I think that's true, but I suppose the thing that I would sort of immediately want to come back on in terms of well, I suppose this is me being a sociologist, and it's interesting that I'm saying this now, because usually I'm the one who's saying what both of you are saying, is that history really matters, and not just history, but 900 years of history in Ireland. And of course that's true, and I absolutely agree with that. But the point I would also make is that being a traveller and being a settled person in Ireland 900 years ago or 500 years ago is very different from both of those statuses today. Like there's no, and that's because there've been huge transformations of the world, obviously, but also just off the top of my head, you think about industrialization, you think about urbanization, but more particularly in terms of what Dylan was saying, I was thinking of the last great kind of colonial reform, if you like, of the 19th century was the Land Acts, and what those did was transform a revolutionary peasant class. In modern terms, you would still say a settled peasant class, but a peasant class which had very different relationship to the land than the small farmers that the Land Acts invented. So that all of those things transform relations between travellers and settled people, and transfer relations between both of those two groups and the state. So on the one hand, of course, you're right, the history matters, but on the other hand, it's not just about the history. There's a massive social transformation going on over that period that you have to also bring into the analysis, and that bringing it back to the present day, some of the issues the really profound issues that you're trying to raise in terms of contemporary traveller experience only makes sense in the context of the state that we have now, in the context of most people living in cities, in the context of there no longer been any peasants in Ireland. It's all small farmers, the kind of people who would shoot travellers rather than welcome them into their house. That's putting it very simplistically, but all of those changes now structure the way that travellers have to fight for justice. And so on the one hand, the history matters, but it also has changed, and we need to be kind of always sensitive to the hugeness of those changes, while at the same time acknowledging the continuity of the colonial experience, which you never have to persuade me of that. I argue to that all the time. I was just thinking as you were talking, the classic example in Belfast is that one of the main streets is still called Chichester Street. It's named after a man who celebrated going out along with Belfast Lough and just butchering men, women, and children as he went. If you read his story, you go, this guy was a genocidal maniac, but still he's celebrated as one of the most important people in the history of Belfast. So of course the history is there, it's present, and it structures our lives, but at the same time the other stuff has to be integrated into the analysis as well.
I think absolutely brilliant points, and you're absolutely right. I think if you look at our brochure and you see the end of it, we went 500 years into the future. So we're not about the past. We don't have a two-part structure where once upon a time things were great and we want to go back there. We're very conscious beings that we're in the here and the now. But if you look at our here and the now in the last 5 years, 50 years, 100 years, or 500 years, it has been psychologically deteriorating. Like in the last 50 years, even with supports and investments and state intervention, we see travelers getting far worse psychologically. So we know there's something psychologically not right in this environment. Where history is important, I believe, is when I talk about settled people's history or any kind of history, I'm actually talking about the present day. Because for me, if Trinity College, Maynooth College, and the Queen's Colleges and the King's Courts, and all them institutions went on to continue to educate Irish people from an English program, therefore colonization had never ended for travellers. So our identity is long lasting as long as them institutions marked it. And that goes back from the 1600s, vagrancy acts and hunting down people. And then you had the penal laws that penalized everybody. Another thing worth mentioning, let's start again. Travellers, Irish travellers right here, right now. That label didn't exist 500 years ago. It didn't exist all that till long ago. Before that, the same people, because I would know this because I was called the same label, would have been thinkers. Thinkers went back a good spell. Then the one before that, around that, was also itinerants. So itinerants went back a long time also, and they're marked or demarked by acts and laws and policies of the empire. So in that parallel universe that we're now talking about, is that these people were identified centuries ago and continued. We may not have been the exact same people as in terms of some of our ancestors are on one side of another, some of them were heroes, some of them were villains, and so on and so forth. We're not playing the victims, but we're bringing settled people's history because settled people's history is killing our present day. So we're trying to draw that attention to the history. And then, of course, I'll also put it another way. We're all human beings are genetically related, almost 100%, 99.9% genetically related. So all we ever could be talking about is psychology or mentalities and cultures and identities. So the most important thing for people to understand is that when the geneticists come out and they said travellers had diverged from the settled population 360 years ago, that is a false narrative because we didn't diverge from a settled population, because the settled population isn't a case of Irish people in a house and Irish people traveling. We also had castles, we had houses, we had lands, we had all of the things that would have been structurally called settled, but we also had this mentality, and it was going on pretty long time. Settled is an institution program, and if you think about this, because when you go to the college, they don't tell you much about the Gaelic culture. Nobody knew anything about the thinkers or the travellers in recent times. They couldn't tell you anything about them. So how could these people be operating in an Irish/Gaelic mentality with English institutions and couldn't tell us who the travellers were? So that's where we're kind of at the moment, I think.
Oh, I mean, I'm in total agreement on that one. The question is always, or used to be always, where do travellers come from? The real question is, where do settled people come from? And that's the kind of interesting, challenging sociological question: is what was that process about? Right. How were they generated? So yeah, I think we can agree that, you know, whether or not everybody came from Africa, at one point in the world, everybody was nomadic. So nomadism is the norm. And then for different reasons in history around the world and also in Ireland, different things happen to create a sedentary or non-nomadic population. And it's that new population which is the odd aberration, if you like. It's not the nomads who have always been there. So that's a useful starting point in terms of tracing that aspect of traveller experience in Ireland. But I mean, I think I said this to you before, that I think it's also useful to see that in a more technical sense, in that just calling people nomads doesn't really adequately describe what they're about, because you can have hunter-gatherer nomads like Aboriginal people in Australia. You can have pastoral nomads like the Maasai, or anybody who's taking, you know, a flock of sheep or a herd of cattle or whatever. They're moving with their animals, so they're pastoral nomads. Or you have what the category that's usually just used to describe not just travellers but Romany Chals in Britain and a lot of Roma across Europe as well, which is commercial nomadism. And I suppose the difference with commercial nomadism is that it assumes a relationship between a nomadic population and a settled population, because if you're a commercial nomad, you have to be, if you're tinsmithing, you have to be selling your tinsmithing work to somebody, and that's a, you know, for want of a better description, that's a settled population or a peasant class that isn't moving, so you're moving as a nomad. So it's already a symbiotic, at its best anyway, a symbiotic relation, a positive relationship where the settled population want what the nomads are providing, and the nomads obviously want to sell that back to them. So, you know, those different forms of nomadism, whether they've all been in there in history, create very different dynamics for the populations that are exercising them. And, you know, the classic example is that, you know, for Australian Aboriginal people, the settler colonial population did nothing for them. It just genocided their culture essentially. But if you're a commercial nomad, you have a more complex symbiotic relationship with the settled population, and that, you know, it begins to give you some flavor of the difference. But at the end of the day, you know, there's no question that the way that you're coming at that question is the right one. It's like, well, where did the settled population in Ireland come from, and what are the implications of understanding that history?
Yeah.
And yeah, and we've a fair idea where they're coming from. I mean, you described it yourself. If you took you were describing it in the 1880s, for example. We could start there and say, you're saying the Land Acts, which redistributed land to create a kind of settled peasantry.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons they're doing that is that didn't exist. We had landlords and we had tenantry on the land before that. And actually, if you take another step back and go to the famine time, roughly around the famine, just before the famine, we have landlords, but then we have large sections from Ulster and then across into the west of Ireland and down the west coast and into Cork and everywhere. We have a huge population, as you know, about 9 million people, but a huge Gaelic-speaking, still culturally Gaelic population. And we don't actually have, especially in my area and in these areas in the northwest, we don't have houses as such left over from that time. We don't have them because in the 17th century, when the English started to English and Irish English culture began to spread out of the Pale, the cottages that are now regarded as traditional were actually called English houses because they were stone rectangular houses, and this is not what anyone in Ireland lived in. So if we keep taking a step back, so before the famine, we won't find anything except in the East counties. I'm not speaking for all of Ireland, but I'd say in most of the Gaelic zones, we won't find things like high kitchen tables and stone houses and big dressers or anything like this. This kind of thing didn't exist because this isn't how Irish people lived. If we take another step back into the 18th century, what happens gradually is that we have less and less evidence of what we would now call settled people.
Yes.
In terms of physically, this is in archaeology, and also we would say psychologically in terms of what Bernard's said. I think he's right to have the dividing line, of course, on mentality. This was always the struggle that the English colony had in Ireland, was struggle of mentalities, if you want to put it that way. For example, a lot of the old laws, the English anti-Gaelic costume laws, anti-Gaelic language, things like this, mostly were directed at their own colonists originally in Kilkenny and everywhere. And for that reason, as we would say, is mainly because what they're trying to stop is Gaelicization of their settled community that pays taxes and what have you, who had this terrible habit of keeping on going to Gaelic brehons and stuff like that. Now, so what we would say simply is that looking for settled people is in sense of mentality wise, and that is that we actually see the great expansion of it is from the conquest in the 1600s onward, and that the modern settled you described one step on the way there, if you know what I mean, which was the 1880s. However, the mentality is older than that. Obviously, the mentality, if we keep going back in time, that mentality is going to be not spread across the country. It's going to be one that's indistinguishable from the mentality that Bernard describes of travellers and other Gaelic people across most of the country. And then if we go right back to, say, 1530, we'll find that it's only around the Pale, and it's only in the cities like Kilkenny, the walled towns like Kilkenny, Cork, and Galway.
Yeah.
And inside them, we'd have a recognizable, settled world, as we would call it now. But outside.
Sorry, I mean, I completely agree. I think the point is that if we could time travel back to the even Gorton Moor, but there would be nothing. The peasant class that was the vast majority of people in Ireland at that time looked nothing like settled people. That's absolutely true. So it's a much more fluid society. The relationship to the land is completely different. So on that basis, you know, your thesis is absolutely right. So that you know that we begin to trace what are the implications of that. It's a new 19th century phenomenon. I mean, I know obviously there's a colonial imposition that you're talking about, but the point at which becomes adopted by the mass, if you like, of Irish people, it's a 19th century phenomenon, and then it's copper fastened, as I suggested before, by the emergence of the 26 county state in 1922, and it suddenly assumes that this is what Irish people should look like.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. Me and Bernard were looking at that. Do you remember you were looking at paintings and stuff? That was the rise of the modern Irish nationalism, the creation of an Irish identity. Bernard had pointed out to me something about they'd sent, you know, even before the Gaelic revival kind of thing in the 19. Okay, so you have the shock of the famine, which causes a huge shift in what you've just described. It really drives a lot of people the adoption of what we would call the settled world or mentality. Eliminates the Irish language almost. People start adopting the mentality. They start changing very quickly. The houses, the language, clothing, even everything. You know. So that's a watershed, yeah, at the famine, as you know. And of course, then we get the construction of a modern Irish identity. And that's a complex thing. I'm not going to pretend to be some huge expert on that, but we did trace some of it in the sense of as you come up towards the Gaelic revival, even as that culture is being destroyed, they're constructing a standard Irish identity almost from the ruins of it, if you know what I mean. And this one is going to be Catholic, but it's very much settled. It's very much, this is the adoption of things like, you remember the paintings of the west coast of idealized Ireland, that even as it's being wiped out, but what it's doing as well is it's masking the Gaelic history. It's normalizing the settled world. So now what used to be beforehand would have been regarded as Englishicized culture of the Pale, okay, the old Catholic English culture of the Pale, which at that stage was now regarded as a version of Irish culture. But now this becomes the new Irish identity normalizes that as that's normal Irish. And if that's the normal Irish culture, then the question immediately becomes then who are travelers, for example, because they represent something else. And if there's something else, well, then what is that? That can't, if we're the indigenous, if, for example, let's just take it as, if the normal culture of, say, South Dublin is the indigenous one to the island and it's normal, then who are these people living on the side of the road? If you know what I mean, and in a different way with a different mentality, and that's what we would trace the sort of the beginning of what you're talking about. Yeah. In 1922, when you remove the English cap on the thing, in a sense, the actual English cap on the administration, then we get the emergence of actually a conflict between that old Catholic settled identity, which had descended from the English colony, and was now cloaked in Gaelicness, if you know what I mean, with the Gaelic revival and that. A bit like Connolly's green post boxes, though, we would suggest. And of course, that identity then would be called into question if they were to look into great detail into the history of people like travellers, and therefore it became this. It seems to have become a thing of well, we don't know who these people are, and of course, it was mixed up in. Let's say they adopted very predictable things that we can actually trace. So we were saying about continuity. For example, Bernard mentioned it, the vagrancy laws. The actual laws, even though it's cloaked in green, they didn't change anything, as we all know. They didn't change anything in 1922 in terms of laws. So an awful lot of the body of law, the court system and everything, actually carried on with the exact same methodology against travellers as had been used against Irish people in general since about 1520s, and that includes characterizing them as nomads, which was actually the basis of, in the 1500s, was the basis of the legality of taking land.
Yeah.
The idea being that, like, it's, what is it, Roman law, that if the people were nomadic, then confiscation of land was legal, and that wasn't an issue. So even if people had a castle, you tore down the castle, threw them to the side of the road, declared them, everyone, to be nomads, and legally that was yours now under the law, which at the end of the day was rubber stamped from Dublin, not even necessarily from England.
For me, there's a couple of markers that stands out, like, again, start in the present, and you can go back to 1963, and that could be the source of our issues. Then you go to 1922 and you figured that the systems hadn't changed. Then you go to the 1600s again, because we have to go up these 3 dates, because for me, it's a continuation. I don't see colonization, imperialism, capitalism, or late capitalism. For me, it's one event that started and had to continue. Doesn't mean people are the same, but the systems are pretty much the same. So if you go back to even the 1530s, where part of the terms and the conditions of surrender and re-grant was to cut your hair, wear English clothes, abide by English rules, adapt an English custom. So if you think about it, in 1620, almost 100 years later, a guy comes along called John Michelin Seed, I think his name might have been, and he created this interesting image about the gentleman Irish, the gentlewoman Irish, the civil Irish, and at the very bottom were the wild Irish.
Oh yeah, Spade. Yeah, I know that map. I know the one you made. Yeah.
So basically, and now we'll go back again slightly, because back to the 1530s in terms and conditions, almost a century later, if not longer, people would have grown up inside an English institution. They would have been Irish, and they would have been Irish in their heart through and through, but they were adapting an English program. So that would be, to me, the emergence of the spread of the settled mentality, because Irish children, after a few generations, will adapt it. I've seen family members growing up as children adapting a settled mentality and actually end up hating travellers, because traveller is the worst thing ever. It's a reminder of some kind of trauma they can't understand. So come up to 1916, where they needed to create a national identity. Dublin's still their finest people, the Yates brothers, Lady Augustus, Margaret, all these top people. And they went into the west of Ireland, the Inishmore, into Achill Island, and the Tinker culture. Now, here's the interesting thing. Why would all these people be going into the west of Ireland for a Gaelic identity unless they were English? So Dublin had an English mentality. That's why they went into the west to get a Gaelic vibe. That was perfectly fine. When they got it, a bit like the Gaelic revivalists, nothing wrong with the people. Nobody's ever done wrong. Everybody was right in their own mentality, in the way they were brought up, in the way they were educated. So we're not blaming anyone. Not then, not now, not ever. Not as long as we understand it. So when they got the identity, it was a Protestant middle class who created the Gaelic revivalists. Again, in a Dublin Englishy vibe, their version of a Gaelic mentality. And of course, the Irish language, the islanders, the travellers, they got suppressed. So come 1922, they kept all the colonial systems. And throughout the decades, you'll see this. Again, a good point also is 1989, the Anti-Hatred Act. TD called Sean Barrett had put an amendment in to remove ethnic and nationality from travelling community. So they come up with this label, travelling community, as if somehow or another we're all travelling together around one place. And you'll even hear some of the traveller academias that got educated in Trinity College in these places. Can't find no written history. We lived on the fringes. I mean, it's like conversations to be having, because one, we're not all descendants from metal working families. The geneticists will tell us that most of us hadn't left our tuas, our areas, our surroundings. We've been here generations. That doesn't mean the culture and the identity or the ethnic. Like, I know I'm going to waffle a bit on here. The word ethnic and ethnicity is to me, very similar. You're right. I do believe every human being has ethnicity. It's just never conscious or brought into question if you're in a dominant group. So since the formation of the state, they never got settled people to ever question themselves, never question the state. It's a given that you are the state, because obviously you're the normal people. It's the other people who are different. So of course, this went on for another couple of generations where we were degenerated, we were primitive, uneducated, unintelligent, and we were pushed to the fringes so much that people were dropping dead. But nobody's ever written a paper that I know of on settled mentality, settled attitudes, and how they're so identical to the English. So when we say anti-traveller, you're really saying, in a historical sense and in the present, anti-Irish, because there's no difference in the language or the words that the English use against the Irish in general, as most settled people sometimes use against travellers. That makes any sense, my friend?
No, it makes I mean, the phrase you use very often in terms of race is pathologized presence, normalized absence. It's that idea that
I've no idea what you're saying. Say that again.
It's pathologized presence. So if these people are present, there's something wrong. They're threatening. They're doing something wrong. But if you're talking about normality, these people aren't mentioned at all. Now that isn't coined in terms of travellers. It's coined in terms of people of colour in the UK in particular. That's where you see that concept. But in terms of travellers, it absolutely makes sense in terms of what you said. It's like when you talk about travellers, it's only because they're doing something wrong and there's something threatening. And when you're talking about ordinariness, normality, travellers are not part of it. Now that, you know, those you can test that thing.
Well, here's the other linguistics connection to it, right? Because Chomsky would say that language isn't taught in school. You don't learn language in a school. You learn it within your community. It's a natural and innate part of you. I disagree with him slightly where it says language doesn't have human behaviors. I believe it does. Because again, we're adapting all the English words, using them against Irish people. Like, you take a step back, it looks like Irish people got colonized, then tried to colonize other Irish people, because that was the normal thing to do, because it went on so long and unchanged. But yeah, I mean,
I better defend it. Well, that's not right, because defend's the wrong word. But to make it clear in terms of the sociological understanding of ethnicity is something that everybody has, and very often I think when some of the traveller resistance to the term ethnicity was, well, half of it was because it's a very technical academic word that doesn't really describe the ordinariness, if you like, of people's lives. So you can see why that people didn't like it for that reason. And, you know, I wouldn't defend it on that basis, but I would defend it in the notion that if you recognize travellers as an ethnic group, you're simultaneously recognizing the category non-traveller as just as much an ethnic group. So ethnicity is not a quality of minorities. It's not a quality of people of color. It's not a quality of nomadic people. It's a quality that everybody has. And if you're identifying one group as an ethnic group, it means that everybody who's not part of that ethnic group is ethnic in a different way. So in that sense, some of the resistance to ethnicity was because travellers saw it as denying their Irishness. To my mind, it wasn't at all. It was just saying that travellers are specifically an ethnic group in the context of Ireland, but likewise, you know, and the point is, as well as being a positive one, it's also a negative one, in the sense that whenever you bring in race discrimination legislation, you're not just protecting the people who've been discriminated against historically, like travellers or black people or Irish people in England or whatever. You're protecting everybody else at the same time. So it's no more legal to put up if you have a pub, to put up a sign saying no buffers than it is to put up a sign saying no travellers. They're both now illegal because those are both ethnic categories. So in that sense, while, you know, I'm sympathetic to people who don't like the word, I do have to defend the notion that when it protected people, it protects everybody. It's not just about.
I actually love the word.
Well, we would have.
I'm going back to the point. I'm going back to the point I missed a minute ago. But I actually love the word. When you were mentioning a minute ago about very similar, and you could see it now with Irish travellers, say black people in England, where we're treated. If you take a step back from that, right, and take a step outside the colonial language, the English language, which was a very systematic language to start with, and other linguists would say that it's not like other human languages. It was a trade language. It was chopped up from other different kinds of languages. So I would say the similarity you see there, you'll see it in Aborigine from Australia, First Natives from Australia, First Natives from Canada. You'll see it from the indigenous peoples in all lands where all European colonization had been. If you were to match up all their similarities, their treatments, the attitudes and the outcomes, they're almost identical. And for me, it's because Ireland was one of the first countries to be colonized by the English, who manufactured a lot of psychological shift in laws and acts and politics. And they could shape people eventually. They were doing it. So they would have went to Virginia Company, which is the brains behind America, the West Indies. They would have gone to Australia, they would have gone to Canada. And that mentality also went with it. Because we look at the Western mentality, it's a very business-orientated way of thinking. It's individual, it's success, it's number one, and they didn't tell the children to go out and conquer the world. So, I mean, it's really textbook trauma language if you don't understand it, I think. That's why I think we have so many similarities around the world with other groups.
Did you see? I was just going to say, it struck me there what you're saying. Yeah, I would think that, like, we had looked at things like, because when we're discussing the Pale, we actually have to equally discuss things like, if we're looking at the, as you're saying, about ethnic status for Irish people, or for travellers and others, that it implies other ethnicities as well. And I would go along with that completely, because we have one of the ironies of that rise of that national identity in the 19th century is that it also suppressed the English history in Ireland. The old English Catholic history that went right back to the 12th century, that we're talking about, is actually also suppressed. And I see there's a lot of work by Ellis, your man Ellis in Stephen Ellis in Galway, on the history of the Pale and things like that. But also recognition from him that actually it's difficult to get people to understand that history as well, because it is also suppressed by the national myth of, if the culture of the Pale is the normal Irish culture, and we don't know who travellers are, we also don't know who these English Catholics are in the past, right? And therefore, there is no English culture. I'm completely Irish, says someone in Ireland who's a settled person now, right? And yet it's not completely true, because all of our mentalities have been shaped by the English conquest and by the colonization in the country and all the rest of it. And therefore, you're right in the sense that we recognizing one ethnicity would actually free us up to recognize many, including the old English colonial one, but even the buried one, like the English Catholic, which I actually think is vital to understand why. For example, it goes back to what we said at the beginning. It's vital to understand the old English Catholic system that had grown up within Dublin, in the Pale and Kilkenny and other places, but particularly Dublin because of its administrative and law grounding, which is there whether the English are there or not. It's actually really important to understand that in order to understand why the Free State would continue its persecution of people living in a different manner than it, if you know what I mean. So that's one example. But I think that actually ethnicity status for travellers and things like that would actually allow us to explore that too, which is part of like the idea of where the settled people come from and who, you know, how many different identities there really are in this country that are all Irish in different ways, but obviously affected mainly by English culture. But that's not the only one. I mean, we also have French culture in Munster and various other strange mixtures around the country that are all, you know, add to the whole thing. Like,
yeah, I mean, and the other, I mean, I can't let this pass just because it's such a sort of interesting historical gem. But I know that you have a particular interest in Montserrat. And the really striking thing is that, you know, you can see in pre-famine writings in Irish, people hearing about the news about these black Gaelic speakers, Irish speakers from Montserrat, and going, there's something wonderful about this. And you know what that tells you is that, you know, Black Irish ethnicity, if you like, was accepted and normalized in before and Gorton War and Gaelic culture. Just people just thought it was interesting, but there was no racist reaction to it or no attempt to deny that these people could be Irish. It just says we love these new Black Irish because they're Gaels. So it's really striking that Ireland has, you know, over the last 20 years struggled to come to terms with the notion that it might be possible to have a Black Irish identity. And yet if you go back nearly 200 years ago, it was just accepted as normal. Like as soon as people heard about the existence of these people who were Irish speakers, they just meant they're Black Irish and that's it. So, you know, that the kind of fluidity and also the ability of people to kind of take that on board shouldn't be underestimated.
I see all the dear Robbie is actually, well, I could be wrong, of course, and everything, but I sense there's an absolute, we're embedded into trauma, all of us. One part of the country or the other, because there's a lot of people even in the town, right, and they've been stripped from any opportunity of education. They've been stripped of their Irish language, and then when they hear, well, we call inverted commas, just for the joke, the Yanks speaking Irish, it really pisses them off and it irks them and it hurts them. And some of that I know myself. I often felt it. You feel it in the solar plex. It's like a shame and a guilt that you should know your language, you should know your culture, but you don't. This kind of feeling. So you get angry at other people when they do it, especially if them people are, you know, coming up to your face speaking in Irish and stuff like this. If automatically you should be speaking. And also I think what happens where sometimes separating travellers as a group and not recognizing them as a community, which is slightly different, because all I've often heard, even modern day politicians, we got other groups too. We got women's groups, children's groups, poor groups, this group. We're saying, well, yeah, we got them all in the group. So we're not a group or a community, that kind of way. But even with that, and a good way of looking at it was the 1963 report, when they looked into the report and they were talking about travellers. These people have no centralized government. These people have no one leader representing them.
Yeah.
And we function like that as common sense. Why would you want one person speaking on behalf of all the different clans? We can speak for ourselves. And that was pretty much a very sort of Gaelic vibe also. As far as I know, according to Dilean, there was no centralized government. So there's nothing strange in the Gaelic culture. Everything is kind of strange in the settled one, like ethnic people moving around and traveling and their customs and their cultures. I mean, all of that was perfectly normal in a Gaelic mentality. And then you had all different groups. You got the higher end of Gaelic culture. You might have the kind of lower end of it. You got Old English who became Gaels. You had the Spanish, you had the French, you had Protestants. So there wasn't anybody couldn't be a Gael. It's whoever adapted that mentality. It was normalized. You were accepted because you were just part of the everyday environment kind of thing. So I think there's definitely a lot to be worked on the mentality, the old mentality of the Gaels, I suppose, and the modern one of the Irish settled, because they're still operating, I think. Oh, the one last thing I want to say about that, no, a lot of things. But to say that when I say that, we're not trying to claim an identity and then turn around and say to everybody else, you're not this, you're something else. We're saying if we go back far enough, go back a few decades, go back a century, go back 2 centuries, we would have came from the same gene pool, the same environment, the same Gaelic world, regardless of where or how we worked or where we functioned in that, with a higher or lower, the ins and the outs. It didn't matter. Post 1920s, post 1600s, beyond the pale was a pretty much Gaelic society. So we don't have to keep proving ourselves to 5th century or this kind of worker. We're just turned on 1600s come. We don't have to prove who we are. All we have to do is start asking the settled people, where did you get your institutions, your acts, your laws, your administration, everything? That's you can date it back into an English kind of institution. So the settled people can think now about identity. When they're asking travelers who we are, just ask themselves who they are. Another thing I would say about identities, because this isn't about traveler versus settled. It's really a human experience. Where in the kind of a situation where a lot of people are dying. So we're not really that hung up about the labels. We didn't care if settled people called themselves whatever. We didn't give a shit. You know, get on with your lives kind of thing. But it seemed to give them bother about the labels we should carry. So I would say that even in the west of Ireland, go back, we're not saying that we're Gaels, you're not. We're Dish, you're not. Keep going back, we can say we're splintered, we're shattered. There's a lot of different pieces of the Gaelic world still operating. Probably even still in Dublin at this point, there still is. But it's kind of bringing that together, that shattered glass together, I think.
I know, but I suppose the bit where I think that falls short, if you like, that is that while you're absolutely right to challenge people, and they should be able to answer it, most of the time they can't. They never have asked the question that way. They still want to know where travelers come from, not where they came from themselves. But at the same time, you know, I put it in comparative context. It's like, you know, Native Americans are dealing with exactly the same kind of challenges that you're talking about in terms of, you know, young travelers in particular, or Native Australians don't just have to pose that question to the white settler population that they live in, but they also have to then also negotiate with a kind of the society that has emerged from that history. And this is the point I'm making about urbanization, industrialization. Like, the world that is oppressing them and excluding them is so far removed from the starting point of, you know, the colonial expropriation of Ireland, that it's not an either or, but you have to have some way of saying, well, we have to deal with the here and now, as well as encouraging these people to confront their own history. And that's in some ways for me the harder bit, because it's, you know, just saying that indigeneity should empower people in North America and should empower people in Australia, while it's true, doesn't actually liberate them in any way. Like, because they then have to use the knowledge that they get from that to confront a system that makes them profoundly unequal. So it's you know, knowing the history is really important. And I whenever I'm hearing you speak, Bernard, I think of Steve Biko and Black consciousness in South Africa, the movement, more than anything else. I think it's really a really important model for travelers. But at the same time, the consciousness is only the starting point of a struggle justice and equality, and at the point where you've raised your consciousness, you then have to step into the real world and confront all these systems and institutions which are discriminating and repressing all the time, and that, you know, that can't be transformed just by consciousness alone. It's transformed through political action.
Well, yeah, exactly. I would suggest, yeah, it is. You're right. It's a political question, but I would say that the you know, it's a bit like you know, if you can't fix an engine unless you understand how it was built, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't want to be taken apart. So we would say that, roughly speaking, yeah, the focus is not on, it's not enough just that people are conscious of where they come from. That's not enough. You have to understand how that system itself was built, because the people within the system could have like you could, you know, the Dublin civil service or the courts or whatever, but you could have the loveliest intentions in the world,
yeah.
but systemic things that have been built 4 centuries ago to consistently make Irish people behave in a certain way, and that are now discriminatory practices. I have no doubt that these were not, even in 1920s and 30s, these were not consciously invoked as like, we're going to complete the process. Although, you know, with some people, it's a bit dubious. Some of them were a bit conscious.
Yeah.
But however, in most cases, we don't think it was conscious. We just think that the machine grinds on and keeps churning people out, doing the same thing in the same way as was done, and they don't know why, and all the rest of it. And of course, as you know, we look at the history in order to understand, firstly, why, and secondly, if that's the case, then maybe we actually can change this. And really, fundamentally, you're trying to change the law. And I think that in Ireland, there would be some understanding of the fact that you have to turn that spotlight around, isn't there? There's 2 things that empires do very, very well. The first thing, or colonized systems do very well. The first one is the spotlight's always on everybody else, not on them, which is what Bernard's described. So the normal people go unremarked. They're not studied. They're not concerned. There's not even a label for them. And that's what we have with the normal Irish system in Dublin. The system in Dublin is not looked at as being kind of its alien construction, is not looked at, that maybe it's the source of discrimination. And the second thing that the colonies do very well, which was, I just read earlier actually, in an essay by Timothy Snyder there about Ukraine, but he said, just that very small sentence, he said, this is the essence of colonial logic. He says, only we, the colonizer, have a history. Anyone whom we encounter along the way does not. And he says, for the purposes of a colonial war, this logic must be insisted upon, you know, even if it rests upon a wisp of baptism. In that case, he's talking about Putin. But I think the logic in there is exactly the same. You know, you see it reemerge in 1963, where, as Bernard had described, and one of the very first things in the 1963 solution, you remember that report that
final solution in
that mentioned the final
report
solution
into itinerancy, 1963.
Well, the very first things in it, which is sort of a backhanded compliment to history. The first thing in it is, we're not going to look into the history of these people specifically. You know what I mean? And we'll leave that to somebody else. And what we're going to do is apply measures right now without having any investigation into anything to do with history. And therefore, I think it becomes kind of a thing of like, it's just becomes a standard with the state. I fully believe because of its colonial origin, and not
well, yeah, that is absolutely true. But I think where what you need to be very careful about in terms of that analysis, it's on the one hand that denial of history is absolutely there, but the commission itself, which is, there's no question about it, it is a commitment to genocide. I mean, it doesn't pull its punches. It says we have to get rid of these people, and that will be a project which is good for them and good for the rest of us. There's no ambiguity. That's what it's about, and that's why it needs to be repudiated. But at the same time, it's an act of modernity. It's not something which is kind of, you know, harking back to the Middle Ages and going, this is the way we treated travellers then, so we have to do it now. It's precisely because the Irish state sees itself as a post-colonial modernizing state that it thinks treating travellers in this way is a normal and positive thing. So on the one hand, being sensitive to the history is really important, but you know, if you want to understand the way that the Irish state works, you have to see that as it's part of its modernizing drive. And an okay part of that is the denial of history, but it's really because it believes this is good for everybody that it should involve itself in this genocide. So it's you know, if you don't understand the modernity of that moment, then you're missing the point that it's rooted in a post-colonial state, not in a colonial state.
I'll give you something that just before Dylan comes on. At the present moment, right, and I actually picked this up from a guy called Oliver Reed. He's a political scientist in America. And he was talking about in the 70s and the 80s how the American government, there was two particular departments only dealing with black people and given barely no recognition. And that was the Department of Justice and the Health Board. Here in Ireland, two departments dealing with travellers. The Department of Justice, where travellers are overrepresented in the prison. The National Health Board called the HSE, where travellers are dropping dead. So the maternity part, you're absolutely right. I'm not blaming anybody in the 1960s. I think most of that was almost subconscious. They didn't know what they were doing. They were trying. There was some with actually good intentions. But the outcomes were absolutely genocidal. Because even when the local authorities today not using funding is putting people's lives at risk. But one thing you probably wouldn't have heard about, and I've never heard a travel organization ever mention it, is at the same time, the HSE mental health department was sending back 48% of its funding that was allocated for traveller mental health. Now, when there's children killing themselves, and everybody knows Travellers has some of the worst statistics on the island, and these departments were playing with people's lives, that is a form of genocide. There's no doubt in my mind about that. Whether they're conscious of it or not, it doesn't matter. And also the history comes into it, because why are people doing this? Where do these systems come from? And again, I suppose we're looking at these institutions that didn't change in 1922, and they spent a lot of money ever since suppressing travellers, that used a lot of English tactics, boulders, fences, evictions, all English ways of breaking down the Gaelic culture. So they're intertwined. It's like stepping outside of time. It's like time relativity. There's two particular times very important to all of this. One is the here and the now, where travellers are dropping dead, where we didn't have these issues going back to decades, let alone the centuries. The other date is going, where did all this start from? Which is a bit like what I said before about standing at the riverbank, watching fish getting sick and dying, and people are trying to help them in the here and the now. But you have to go up rivers to find out what poisoned them. 1963, 1922, 1600, time does not matter, because we're also looking at this at a very human level, where we're trying not to just to decolonize, we're also looking to de-traumatize. And you don't tell someone who was traumatized, you cannot rule out one thing or another. You cannot go past 1922, because that would make some difference. So you have to go as far as that person can go with it to understand it, I guess.
If I would have just to say to that, I would say, your point is an interesting point about I wouldn't call it post-colonial though, because I would say that it fits exactly with what we're saying, in the sense that if you look at the makeup of the committee of the 1960s.
Sorry, I know this shouldn't really interrupt, but I would say its self-identity is post-colonial. That's a key thing. It sees itself as a post-colonial modernizing state.
We're being modern,
And it's in that framework that somebody goes, well, why don't we just get rid of travellers and everybody would benefit? I agree with you, really. Was it a post-colonial? Absolutely not. Ireland is still a colonized state, north and south. As I pointed out to you before, when they partitioned Ireland, the 6 counties, clearly was further integrated into Union and Empire. There's no ambiguity around that. But the 26 counties was not a republic. It was not an act of self-determination. It was a construction that was essentially a white dominion within empire. So that's the framework. That's the real framework in which we find ourselves even today. But the sense of self that the state had was one that it was a post-colonial modernizing state. That's really significant in terms of the fact that it has the energy to put into an act of genocide against travellers.
So I would say that I'd say it's fascinating. It's something that needs to be studied further. And I think Bernard was talking before about making a documentary about that kind of thing. And we think it's kind of a thing that could be centered, that would warrant further study outside of my, obviously not the middle age, outside of my area in a way, because 1963. But I would say my thought on that just briefly would be that it fits perfectly with the way I would look at it as well, because although they do see themselves as modern, I completely agree with your point. However, if you look at the makeup of the committee, very simple thing, look at who's on it. It's like the butcher, baker, and the candlestick maker. It's like the farmer, the class that you described, who emerges in the 1800s, if you know what I mean, and everybody else after that.
Agricultural backgrounds,
It's almost like a cross section of the old Pale society. It's like the most settled world version of a committee you could possibly put together. Now, now, I would just say that it's absolutely predictable that from their point of view, it wouldn't matter if it was 1520, 1620, or 1963. They're going to come up with the same answer. Do you know what I mean? Wouldn't it be better, because we have documents that say it in the 1560s or whatever time you want to take?
Ulster plantation.
Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't everything be better? And wouldn't we be more modern if these people weren't here?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I would say that, despite, and it's absolutely really makes it actually more interesting, that if you put it in the context you're talking about of it being actually, they think they're being really modern, and yet they fall straight into the trap of doing exactly what the colonial state in Ireland had spent 4 centuries doing, which is that the only way that we can be normal, inverted commas, and advance and all that. And now, in fairness, some of these people, they're no longer like in 1560. They're not actually English colonists. What they are is, they could be Irish people, but they've absorbed this idea of modernity. Even is completely is a thing that we see in lots of colonized countries, where they've absorbed, internalized the oppression from the colonists, from the colonial power, and now everything that's modern is nothing to do with our past, and it's everything to do with becoming like the English, if you know what I mean. And you'll see that in a lot of colonized countries, where they can't envisage going forward unless it's to get rid of everything that reminds them of their own past. Now, so you could have a bit of both going on. It would warrant.
I think that's broadly true, but there's a difference, I suppose, in the sense that you see it in that contrast between underdevelopment and development. And the point is that that colonialism, by definition, was about the underdevelopment of the colony. It was removing resources to the center of empire, and it was, the economic foundation of colonialism was to underdevelop the colonies, just to strip them of whatever the colonizer thought was useful. The post-colonial mentality is slightly different, and sometimes it sees itself as precisely a counter to that. So it's about development, and you think of the Aswan Dam as a classic example but rural electrification is a classic example in Ireland, when they suddenly go, well, the English didn't electrify, so the new state will do this. So that notion of development fits very neatly and resonates with exactly what they're trying to do, with what Whittaker's doing with the state, actually, in the early 1960s. And then it's no accident that the Commission follows hot on the heels of this notion of a new, modernizing, developing state, industrializing, developing state. So it's, you're right, there's a historical legacy, but anyone who analyzed colonialism would tend to see that colonialism linked to underdevelopment and the ideology that was feeding the kind of interventions that I'm talking about in 1960 was precisely a counter to colonial underdevelopment and industrialization and all the rest of it. So it's there's a continuity, but there's also a rupture with history, which is really significant as well.
You could say that. Although I wouldn't see any difference between the state that's in Dublin and throughout the centuries. We wouldn't see much difference in its behaviour. You know what I mean?
There's also a different kind of experience involved, because Dublin came sort of colonizer/colonizer. Northern Ireland then had a different kind of experience. Then the west of Ireland had a completely different experience. I think it was Edward Said when he was talking about imperialism, and I think he was making the difference between imperialism and colonization. Colonization is when they came onto the land. So England would have been colonizing other lands. Take America, come 50s, 60s in Ireland here, they were an imperialist. So they were feeding their colonial mentality influences through that channel. So I think I think it's get a bit mind-boggling at times, because one way you want to explain to people that we're not taking anything away from anyone, and who we are shouldn't bother anyone else. But if anything, we're trying to give back something, because we would see the settled population as lacking something. In other words, lacking a deep understanding of their own culture, to Gaelic culture and all that kind of stuff. And even if you were speaking the native Irish language, the foundation and the environment around you was still colonial English. And the only reason you got some peace is because you stayed in a house on the land, and then you were moving around, you were a moving target. So that was the only real difference, I think, divided us over time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to bring us back to our title that we've kind of strayed a wee bit from, but I mean, I would say it in this context that there's more of a conversation, at least, around reunification and the implications of that and what that might mean. And it's very important that travellers are part of that conversation. But at the same time, where Travel Vision has got it absolutely right, I think, is that you locate that conversation not in what does it mean to get rid of the border, but what are the implications of saying that Ireland still needs to be decolonised? That's the starting point for that. Now, if you do that, all the issues that you're raising in terms of the history of colonisation and the fact that it hadn't settled people are absolutely pertinent, because you're saying to people, well, what are the implications of decolonising now for us in the present and the future? What would that mean? The language is one obvious example. Most people would still like to have a language, but most people don't have Irish. So there's an issue of how that can be revived if that's what people want. But there's also a question of people's relationship to the land. Like, clearly there was a colonial dispossession going over, as we've discussed already, 800 years. So what would it mean to actually talk about a new relationship between the Irish people and the land, which was kind of promised by in the Proclamation of 1916, but never delivered on. So all those questions are absolutely pertinent to the question of what does it mean to decolonize. And I suppose the only thing I would add to that is that in terms of the conversation that settled Irish people and traveller Irish people have around that, is that it's never going to be an event. It's never going to be, we get rid of the border and then suddenly things are only okay. Decolonisation is something that, if it happens at all, happens over a long period of time and happens incrementally, and is something which people have to struggle over again and again and again and again. So in that sense, the political question that confronts us in terms of this notion of united Ireland and united people, that where you're starting is the right place to start, like with the history, and then bring it up to the present.
Yeah, I would say that the decolonisation thing is great, because in the sense, I think it's the correct way to start as well, because it kind of the process you'd want to go through before you went anywhere near changing any particular borders or anything, in my mind. Because of everything we've just talked about.
Yeah.
But also it puts us it puts us in a context where we have where we're in an international process. It's not just Ireland. Then it becomes everyone's informing everyone else, whether it's Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, America, whatever. And that's great too, because you've got all these different accounts of colonization, and then also ways of trying to deal with it. And I would say, I was going to say on a funny note, the land you mentioned about the land appropriation. What I noticed that it's a fact at the moment that the Land Commission records that are held somewhere in some big shed in Offaly or somewhere very strange like that, the government still won't give access to them for historians.
Yeah. And the obvious related point to that is that that there is some, as we saw at that recent conference in Galway, there's quite a lot of good contemporary research being done around traveller spaces that used to belong to travellers and now don't, and are now very often surrounded by boulders and all the rest of the stuff that we talked about. But to me, decolonisation is about more than just remembering that history, but going to what was the process of these spaces that were traveller spaces being removed from travellers, and then the concomitant question of, well, what would reparation or restitution look like in that context? How would we restore those spaces to the traditional owners? And you begin to see that happening in Australia and North America and Canada and places like it. But that's precisely what the question around decolonisation should mean in terms of relationship to land in Ireland. It's like all those spaces, first of all, have to be recorded. We're starting to see that happening a wee bit. But the second point is then, well, how are they returned to travellers? And that then becomes a much more complex and contentious political question, because who knows who's got possession of them.
Well, I think that's why it has to be brought. If I may say, that's something you might want to mention about that, Bernard, is that we had looked at it very one thing happening that we thought was positive in that regard is that in Ireland, obviously in Ireland, it's complex in the sense that we have the question of returning things to communities, though, becomes much wider, because now it's like, well, the whole island was colonized and everybody in it is affected in different ways.
Yeah.
So what would be fair and what wouldn't be fair? Well, obviously we're looking for equality for the communities that still suffer the most from that history not being addressed in the law.
Yeah.
But we noticed that back in January, on a positive note, that the Supreme Court in the South made that decision about in the case against what was the family, Bernard?
Oh, that was the 31st of January of this year. Bernard McDonough and Helen McDonough, and the Supreme Court ruling in Ennis, County Clare.
Yeah, and in that ruling, the court acknowledged that in the 100 years since 1922, just like we talked about, that actually that the system, the law, which by implication it had inherited from the Empire days, and from the long history of Dublin's law, had failed to provide justice to people who lived in like travellers lived, if you know what I mean. I can't remember, I'm paraphrasing it, whatever court language it was, and that it would be justified at this point in the making a decision that the constitutional recognition, basically it was down to what's a house. What is a house? Of course, a house in English law can only be what the English law says is a house. And of course, all Irish law is in fact English common law and all the rest of it, basically just modified to our conditions a little bit. And therefore, Irish houses explicitly were never recognized, or the Irish way of living was never recognized. But the Supreme Court made the decision in January that actually the full protection of the Constitution for the home could be extended to travellers' temporary site at the side of the road, that they'd a couple of caravans, I think, and whatever else. And we think that's historic, because we think that's a precedent, and also it's actually a form of what I would suggest, maybe, I don't know what you think, of how decolonization actually would work in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's these little straws in the wind, but they are really important that we celebrate them. But it also shows that there is some flexibility in the system as well. Like sometimes you can actually win as well, and that there's a significance in that too. But I think the point we would all share is that if you're serious about decolonization, it would be so much more profound than the implications of that decision, which no doubt will be restricted in terms of the real implications, in much the same way as the victory, if you like, on ethnicity has actually had very few tangible positive benefits for travellers. So that decolonization, if it means anything, would mean a profound rethinking and redistribution of power in Irish society, north and south of the border. So it's, while that may be a hint at where it's going, the implications of doing it properly are much bigger than that, I think.
Well, it's like a crowbar in the door, I would have thought. It's like
there you go. Okay.
Probably the worst.
The only reason I would hesitate of that is because, I mean, like Bernard would be much more critical of the function of the term ethnicity and all, but I mean, I think a lot of people expected a lot more, and I still think it was a significant victory, and I still think that ethnicity denial by the state showed you how significant it was to fight that fight. But the reality is it has not transformed.
But I would say that exact, just very briefly, that decision by the Supreme Court wouldn't have happened except for the campaign for ethnicity, which actually, because the state recognized the ethnicity, then it allowed the Supreme Court to make the decision. And actually, even though the judge might have his own other reasons, and I'm sure children in the nation equally, it's good. It's from little simple starts and acorns. One of the reasons we look back a bit further on this all the time is for exactly that reason, is that, like, from my perspective, anything you create that the state is funding, without the state having first done the work that we talked about of decolonization and recognizing where it comes from, is always going to turn into what you've just described. Because that's what it is. It's been doing that for 400 years, and it's not that the state can reform itself. We've looked at things that it can do, but it has to understand. We would have to campaign or understand first that so these laws, like for example, Bernard had said that only just like in the US, that the only people dealing, the state entities dealing with travellers was Department of Justice and Department of Health. Is it HSE? Yeah, so on the one hand, there's something wrong with them, and on the other hand, they're actually the internal security problem, if you know what I mean. And that's historic. And that tells us as well, though, that no matter how the state engages, if the state creates NGOs, whatever, it's not capable, it hasn't been capable of, because that's not its origin, to allow alternative Irish identities on the island to exist. And actually, it holds up a warning sign as well for things like unification because of integration. When we're talking about other communities like Protestant communities or and other identities on the island, if it's incapable of dealing with the old Irish identities, travellers and Irish-speaking communities in the Republic have no great history with the state either, which is continually ground away at their ability to revive and even comfortably use the language. And I would suggest for the exact same reason.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the only thing I would say about that is I think it's slightly too mechanistic to see the sector, if you like, what I would still call the traveller support movement, although Bernard probably won't like that kind of characterization. But the sector had relative autonomy from the state. So the state was trying to do something with travellers and the sector was trying to do something different. And they're not, you know, sometimes of course they overlapped, and of course sometimes they were much too closely and working in tandem whenever the traveller support movement should have been much more oppositional, in my opinion. And I think Bernard would probably agree with that as well. But at the same time, they're not the same things. Like, and just because the traveller support movement or the traveller organisations were doing something didn't mean that the state had cleverly worked out a Machiavellian strategy to make that intervention and it never works that way.
If I would ask you, Robbie, how would you see decolonization? I mean, across the whole island, would you see it as, how would you see this decolonization process ideally?
There's a small question. Well, I mean, the border has to go. That's why I'd be much more optimistic about it. At least that creates a proper structure to begin the rest of these conversations. Like, you know, the immediate indication of the continuing colonization of Ireland is the continued existing, well, the continued existence of both states, because one can't live without the other, but more particularly the constitutional link between the 6 counties and the UK. So in that sense, something that looks like it might happen, at least as a possibility, would be an important precondition for a broader process of seriously asking what does a decolonized state look like. So that's all. You know, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but nevertheless, it's true. It's like you have to create the constitutional political context in which at least it's possible for the Irish people to self-determine. And then the next question is, well, what is decolonization? What does self-determination mean in that new context? But until we can't self-determine as 26 counties in the 6 counties, I take that as a given. But I mean, I suppose the other point, it's also that thing about it's a politics, and it's a politics that I know people used to use this term partnership. It was like travellers are meant to be in partnership with the state and settled people and all the rest of it. And I hated that word. And now it seems to be allyship, but I hate that. I think that's coming from BLM, but I don't like that word any better. No. To me, those alliances are made because people are in struggle, and that's because, you know, travellers are in struggle for obvious reasons, for all the things we've talked about, but so are, you know, working class communities, so are LGBT communities. You know, there's a whole series of communities in struggle who would like to see a transformed Ireland, a decolonised Ireland. So the politics that will get us there is a politics that builds alliances between those people. And, you know, insofar as I've done anything that's helpful to progressing the cause of justice for travellers, it's because it's in my interest to do that. Like, that's like, go back to the point where we started. It's like the reason I was interested in understanding and doing something about anti-traveller racism was because it was used against everybody else at the same time. It was a tool of reaction. So, of course, at one level, I had empathy and sympathy with travellers who were shittily treated by the state and by local politicians who were saying outrageous genocidal things about travellers. But they were doing it not just to be mean or horrible or victimise travellers, they're doing it to create a context for reaction and inequality. So in that sense, you know, my when I stand in solidarity with travellers, it's because it's in my interest to do it. And what we all have to do is find the traveller politics that is happy to speak to that broader project. And at the end of the day, I don't think that's my choice. It's for people like Bernard to decide what that looks like. But we'll all know at the point that we've got there, because we understand exactly what that vision of difference, a different Ireland is about, what vision of a decolonised Ireland is about. It's going to be more equal. It's going to have a different relationship to its history in the way that we've talked about, and it's going to be much more celebratory of difference in the way that was promised by the proclamation in 1916. You get no more powerful vision of a post-colonial society than the notion of a society that genuinely cherishes its children equally. And I said this a couple of weeks ago, but I'll repeat it again, is that if Ireland's serious about equality and self-determination, then it has to start with cherishing its traveller children equally. That's a simple vision, but if people can't subscribe to that, then it's not an Ireland that I want to live in.
That's an interesting one, and I actually give us kind of the other side of that. That would be similar to me saying that maybe the NGOs must go for all, or do we try to change the mentalities of the people that works in the organizations? So therefore, by default, they change their practices and their attitudes, and therefore the environment changes naturally. So you're caught between which one goes first, the NGOs or the borders. Talk, action first, talk later. There's a couple of bits and pieces that I think will go into that.
Oh, well, yeah, you're dead right. But I mean, maybe what I said was sounded a bit too mechanistic. Of course, all the things that you're saying about raising consciousness should be happening all the time. Like if if you're going to decolonize a country, you have to start with decolonizing your own mind. There's no question about
Absolutely.
that. But all I'm saying is the next stage is then, well, what do we do about all the other stuff? I've liberated myself, but there's still another project to be getting on with once you've done that.
I would say that the 16 rebellion and its roots in Connolly's vision of that federation that allowed all that how would you put it? Unity from diversity. I think that all sounds grand to me. Yeah.
So I would like to get to a point where we can sort of celebrate the arts and show the Catholics, Protestants, travellers, white people, black people. A lot of these labels are colonial, and we can move away from them. We can sidestep them eventually, I'd like to think. Now, Mr. Robbie McVeigh, finish it off.
I don't think I have anything else to say, Bernard, except to commend you for the work. I mean, I think what you're doing is really, really important. I think it has opened up a space that doesn't exist naturally in terms of organizations which tend to be very institutionalized and are working to particular agendas and have to for good and bad reasons be very sensitive to the relationship they have to the state which sponsors them. So for all those reasons, it actually is hard to create a space to have the kind of discussions that you're having, and that's why I think it's so significant. So it's brilliant that you're doing it. But as I said to you before, I get the sense that there's a more general acceptance that something does have to change, and the kind of intellectual phrase I would use for doing that is changing the paradigm. And but all that's saying is that the way that we're doing this work at the minute isn't working particularly well, and we need to do something radically different in order to transform traveller lives. So to do that, we have to create the space that you're creating to have these conversations, and I think that's really important. And it's been a great pleasure, I have to say, for me to take part in that. So many thanks for inviting me.
I'm honoured, quite honest. I think a good way of decolonization is a few good Life of Brian movies in Ireland. And we take the piss out of everyone, Catholics, Protestants, the Pales people, you name it. Because that's the only way I think we'll apply some humour. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll talk for a second, then we'll let everyone go home to bed.
Right.
So thank you very much for your time. I really, truly appreciate it. Both of you.
Appreciate it,